Greetings! A new balance patch, as well as a hotfix for that patch, have dropped on Robocraft. I am here to give you the lowdown on what has occurred and to provide thoughts on such. The first thing that I want to mention is that the 2D diagonal rod has taken a 1 CPU reduction and its health value and robo-ranking weight have been adjusted accordingly. This change was unnecessary, even if it was intended to bring the part in line with the rod arc part. It is also noted that any part for which CPU is reduced, it is more difficult to increase the CPU in future, as such would break builds, pushing them into higher tiers or maybe even megabot territory. Even so, this particular change is trivial enough and with an understandable enough logical foundation that I am uninclined to knock it. Let's talk health changes for other chassis parts. Medium blocks and light blocks have both taken a 200 health increase per CPU, meaning that this is a bigger buff for lower health light blocks than it is for medium blocks. Heavy blocks were untouched, helium blocks were untouched, compact blocks were untouched, rods were, for the most part, untouched. All mono-connection electroshields took a 13% increase in health. All multi-connection electroplates were untouched. All dual connection struts took a 12% increase in health. All quad connection point struts took a 9% increase in health. Those are the changes to chassis parts. This is what a summary of chassis parts looks like, with different categories of values per CPU specified. Let us look at this and first ask the question, are heavy blocks underpowered now? It was my original assumption that they would lose out to medium blocks, which they do in a small way. However, the truth is that heavy blocks aren't really so heavy to begin with, being only 7 times the weight of mediums. As such, this particular relationship is acceptable even following the buff to mediums. Less acceptable is the buffing of struts such that they now offer the same level of health as a heavy block at the weight of a medium block. What is even less acceptable is the relationship between lights and mediums. Light blocks are 12.5 times lighter than medium blocks and now enjoy 80% of medium blocks' health. This is a boon for airbots in general, and the main beneficiaries would be Teslas, drones, and other light flyers, skewing the air-ground balance further in airbots' favor. Continuing the trend of that which is unacceptable, let us speak of compact blocks. Looking at these stats, can anybody with a straight face state that they deserve to retain their Tier 5 status? They now enjoy less health per CPU than Tier 2 light blocks, and RexHackBro's Tier 3 helium blocks are laughing at them in their rearview mirror. It was always my opinion that compact blocks never deserved to be Tier 5 blocks in the first place, but at this point their power level is such that even if they were finally brought down to Tier 4, their practical use would be constrained to buffing narrow sections of builds, and perhaps the occasional weapon mount, presuming that the player wouldn't rather use the higher health heliums instead. Speaking of heliums, they may not have taken a buff in this particular patch, but remain statted in a way that is nothing short of obscene. This T3 part, which is supposed to provide lift and not be spammed within ground bots to shore up heavy's lackluster health, has more health than even compacts, which cost 3 times as much and are a whole 2 tiers above them have. They mock all other chassis parts' healths, including heavy blocks and dual connection struts, which are the next contenders in line, and only a little short of double the mono connection electroplate's health. Their stats are obscene, and their health should never have been buffed, especially not to the dismay of the vast majority of the balance server whom fought against the push for 6000 health, a proposal that was inserted into the topic channel from day one and was only reduced much later on but never removed, in spite of opposition. A change pushed through by RexHackBro whom directly abused his position to push through that change to the detriment of the game. And the reason why this is relevant today is because the so-called balance server are making their considerations for balance based on preserving the health of heliums. They do not particularly care if heavies on their own can stand up to struts or monoconnection electroplates or other parts, just so long as RexHackBro's mesh of heavies and heliums can stack up against them. That is the kind of corruption that pollutes the so-called balance Discord that FreeJam unfortunately chooses to listen to. But there are more balance changes to go through, and so I will come back to this point later. Electroplates. The balance server seem to really hate multi-connection point electroplates, and have been trying to nerf and nerf and nerf it. I don't use such electroplates, but that doesn't stop me from feeling sorry for them. Sure, such electroplates used to be really good on things like sandwich planes and electroplate sprinter planes, but continuing to neglect the parts runs the risk of turning them into trap parts, parts that look nice and cool and are therefore continue to be used, but which are a horrendous CPU sink. At this point, multi-connection electroplates have as much health per CPU as light blocks, and are heavier. Most of them are also of a higher tier than light blocks, being at tier 2. There is something very wrong here. The entire purpose of an electroshield is to serve as a shield, and such low health amounts are jeopardizing that role, and they have been further weakened as compared with every part that got buffed. And while some might complain about them being tanky, that again is literally the point of them. And to those who would pull out such an argument, I would answer that any pain relating to the toughness of a bot relating to this part relates more to the firepower that that same bot is dishing out rather than the toughness of the part electroshield itself. Before moving on from chassis parts, I will echo the sentiments of Cormy1. In the so-called balance patch, there were a lot of upward adjustments in chassis part healths. With all of these buffs, those that were not, namely heavy blocks, compact blocks, rods and multi-connection electroplates, all of these were nerfed through neglect. I won't count heliums as their RexHackBro stats speak for themselves. Well, something that Cormy1 said that resonated with me is that you don't buff tanks to overcome tank killers, but rather you question whether tank killers need to exist in the first place, and that such should be nerfed accordingly. In other words, he seems to have been saying that it is actually outlier DPS weapons that need more of a reining in rather than chassis parts continuing to be power crept. Fair enough, and keeping in mind that he had chain guns in mind when saying this, that would involve T5 chain guns losing a little of their damage, maybe regaining a little of their sustain along the way, and maybe a little of the range that was irresponsibly slashed by the power creep server. It is also to be pointed out that the power creep server's increase in weapon energy modules power level by over 50% in a single update did not help the situation either. Moving on. We now come to changes in weapon balance. Lasers have taken a very significant improvement in accuracy and have taken a 10% reduction in energy consumption across the board. The changes mean that lasers have become significantly better overall. Testing also reveals that while the inaccuracy of repeat fire is a little more severe than prior, the recovery time is so rapid that constant tap firing will result in near constant shooting with near perfect accuracy. Unfortunately, this does mean that less scrupulous players can now use third-party assist mechanisms to much greater effect than before, and it is only a matter of time before the issue with this becomes more apparent. Moving on, we find changes to plasmas. Plasmas have taken a significant increase in change and projectile speed. Okay. Also, all plasmas from tier 2 and up have taken a 10% reduction in energy cost. Now, why would the balance server omit T1s and T2s from that change? Well, the reason is because those tiers of plasmas can be found in tier 1 and deal massive damage to tier 1 bots. That would seem reasonable, and it is to a point, but it is also the wrong overall approach. You see, the current situation is that a tier 1 bot cannot ever be greater than 1000 CPU in CPU cost because the robo-ranking ceiling is set to 1000. As a result, new players have access to smaller bots and start simpler. Sounds good, right? Well, yes and no. Because not only will bots that go over 1000 CPU, or sometimes less depending on the tier of parts used, end up in tier 2, but a tier 1 bot can still end up facing a tier 2 bot anyway. Or even a tier 3 bot if I'm not mistaken. That is a tier 2 bot that doesn't have the artificially low CPU ceiling, and so tier 1 bots with new players will end up facing inherently unfair odds, and this while they are still figuring out if they actually like the game and would like to continue playing it. If FreeJam truly wants to facilitate the onboarding process for new players in Robocraft 1, then the least they should consider is to grant a single 2000 max CPU bay to new accounts. That, along with a rise in robo-ranking to 2000 for tier 1, would be an improvement, and it is okay for tier 2 and tier 3 robo-ranking ceilings to be modestly bumped up accordingly. Sure, there would be less place for sub-2000 CPU bots in Robocraft, but let us be honest with ourselves. The core design of Robocraft 1 is not currently conducive to the existence of such, and user experience should come first. That was Plasmas. And now we come to Flak. Oh, Flak. The so-called balance server had an opportunity to do right by Flak. Flak is a weapon that has taken many changes. It also got sort of hotfixed, at least officially. To explain the changes simply, Flak has been ruined for most unassisted human players. The irresponsible increase in projectile speed, even in its hotfixed reduced speed, has resulted in a decidedly more ugly and harder to see projectile, but this isn't really the issue. The trigger radius has been decimated and hotfixed to a less bad but still inadequate degree. And let us pause here to consider Flak as a weapon. What is Flak intended for? Well, it is supposedly intended to punish players for flying out in the open. More than that, it was supposed to counter the kinds of flyers that were causing the most problems, and those would be short exposure flyers, things like drones back then. Unfortunately, they never were really good at that, but were really good at taking out longer exposure flyers, which tended to be less in need of countering to begin with. In other words, it was strong with the weak and weak with the strong. Now the thing is that prior to my muting on the so-called balance server, or Robocraft balance patches server, whatever, I had already made noise as regard to how Flak might be fixed. And one key thing that both me and Cormy1 were and are of the opinion of is that the maximum Flak stacks being high contributed to a situation where short exposure flyers just weren't being punished enough, while long exposure flyers were, well, different. Seeing max stacks be reduced in this patch was therefore promising, but as tends to be the case with this balance server, they decided to shovel a bunch of crap on top of it to render it near enough irrelevant. For one thing, they only halfway implemented the stacks reduction that we both agreed upon would be the way forward, which is bringing Flak stacks down to 1, at the very least 2, but 1 ideally. And secondly, they decimated the detonation range for Flaks, making the weapon significantly harder to use against precisely the kinds of targets that it needs to be effective against. The result is a Flak that only an artificial intelligence or an AI-assisted player can love. Now, why would a Flak user on the balance server want to make Flak more difficult to use? The answer is that it wasn't a Flak user who was responsible for the most offensive changes to Flak this patch. This is one change that almost certainly may be traced back to a certain quote-unquote competitive player whom didn't like that Flak could impede his vision when being struck, or that it required less skill to aim and hit at a distance, or that it stripped the surface of bots like drones. This being the same person, mind you, responsible for the slashing of chain gun's range because, quote-unquote, he didn't like that competitive players could get tagged by it at range. This being the same player whom then proceeded to uninstall Robocraft after he had left his mark for the memes. And this being the same player whom the so-called balance servers, gatekeepers, RexHackBro and Terapiata360 chose to push forward, and which FreeJam thus implemented, and thus we now suffer. If what Robocraft balance needs is a surgeon with a scalpel, then the so-called balance server that is currently operating upon Robocraft is the equivalent of a butcher with a hacksaw, and it is really starting to show. I can understand that FreeJam is too busy developing Robocraft 2 to curate the updates being pushed its way by these individuals whom claim to represent the community. However, they surely must know that the worse that the balance is in Robocraft 1, the more valid it should be to pose the question in future as to whether balance in Robocraft 2 shall be any better. As such, this is what I propose to FreeJam. If you must continue listening to and dealing with the corrupt gatekeepers whom pretend to represent the player community, then at least require that they up their quality assurance, and this in the following manner. Firstly, impose a 10% value change soft limit with a 20% hard limit, provided that justification is provided. In this way, balance updates are less likely to feature such obscene changes as a 25% increase in health for helium blocks of all blocks, a 56% reduction in chain guns range, a 50% increase in energy modules effects, or a 4000% increase in projectile speed for Flaks. If the power creep server truly believes its changes and direction to be worthy of such, then it will commit to changing values over multiple updates to get around these restrictions. Partial updates could also serve to provide the balance server with a reality check. Secondly, require a link to a Discord message which serves as an index message, which itself has links to notable feedback received, so that you may, if you should choose to do so, verify that changes being forwarded to you on behalf of the community was at least influenced by suggestions on the community level. This also allows for easier auditing. Thirdly, consider getting a different source of balance updates. Too many changes that have been pushed through with these updates should be raising red flags concerning the reliability of those whom insist on gatekeeping balance for the game. They whom term dissent as disrespect, those whom would rather silence and blind the most competent among them in order to consolidate their position, rather than to ensure that Robocraft gets its best chance at a positive balance update. Those whom have the audacity to be called project leads and management. Individuals whom couldn't be trusted to preside over the balancing of a coin toss, let alone a game as complex as Robocraft is. It should be clear to you that I hold a grudge against these individuals, but my grudge is rooted in validity. I regard RexHackBro and Terapiata360 as being bad for the game, so much so that I consider them to be an even greater threat to the game than I consider matchmaking experts to be, and as you would know, for me to say that, that is saying something. And the worst part is that they feel that they can operate with impunity, that they are untouchable, the pigs whom are more equal than others. It is my view that the seemingly uncaring nature of the leadership of that discord will come back to haunt you if they are permitted to continue to sully that which remains of Robocraft 1. While you might think that Robocraft 1 is yesterday's news, even if it shall always hold a place in your hearts for helping to make FreeJam that which it is today, it would be a deep strategic error to be of the opinion that Robocraft 1 has no place in your futures. For just as Robocraft 2, as Mark himself put it, is for Robocraft players but 10 years older, so too does Robocraft 1 have the potential to become Robocraft 2 players but 10 years younger. There is a reason as to why Robocraft 1 lasted for near enough a decade so far and still stands the test of time in the most important ways in spite of the threats that matchmaking and so-called balance servers pose to it. The game isn't just an Overwatch 1 that can simply be closed down and replaced with an Overwatch 2 with nicer graphics and tweaked balance. Robocraft 1 is different in a much more meaningful way. So much so that even when Robocraft 2 kicks off, and matures with just some actual care and preferably restoration of that which has been lost, both games could likely thrive, and not to the detriment of each other, again being suited for different demographics and playtastes. Allowing the charlatans whom gatekeep the balanced server to drag Robocraft 1 through the mud is not an indignity that I as a mere player would like to stand by idly to watch, and I would hope that you, FreeJam, will take measures to ensure that Robocraft 1 gets respected more in future. To be clear, in spite of their transgressions, I still think that the two individuals whom I am railing against should be permitted to have a voice in balancing. But they have proven on multiple occasions at this point that a position of trust where they determine what makes it into balance patch updates is something that they have proven themselves to be unsuited for. So think about that. With that tirade out of the way, my attention now turns back to the general viewer. How do you feel about the changes to chassis parts? Do lasers seem more fun to play? How does it feel to face them? How do you feel about the changes to plasmas? How are you finding Flak? Do you feel that my tirade against the leadership of the Robocraft balanced Discord server is unjustified? Do you support the way that the Robocraft balance server operates? Do feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and I will meet you there. And, of course, thank you for watching.